Chapter 21, An Even Less Likely Partnership. That night, I swung open the hatch to the hold. I hadn't brought a lantern with me, and the chasm below was pitch black. "Psst! Beau!" I whispered. "Come up!" A moment later, I heard him climbing the ladder. Cautiously, he lifted his head above the hatch. "What's wrong?" "It's a new moon tonight, so it's dark up top, and most of the crew is playing cards in the galley. I think I can get you on deck if you promise to be very quiet." Beau's face broke into a wide, dimpled grin. He held up his right hand. "I'll be silent as the rotting bones in a graveyard." "Gross," I grinned back. "Now come on." Beau was true to his word. He was quieter than a shadow. He slunk around corners, folding his body into the darkness. Several times we nearly ran into one of the crew, but Beau seemed to have a sixth sense for when someone was watching and when they had turned their back. He floated silently over the dark deck, timing his footsteps with the dip and rise of the ship. I couldn't help thinking that even Mud would be impressed with him. We climbed up to the forecastle, where Rian and I had had our conversation about the Sunderlands the week before, and I led Beau to the same spot between the stacks of folded canvas. We crouched, silent at first, until we were sure the waves splashing against the hull would drown out our whispers. I felt guilty huddled inside my wool cloak while Beau wore nothing but thin deck clothes. "Here," I started to unclasp the cloak from my throat. "You should take this." "Nah, keep it," he said. "I like the cold air on my skin." He leaned against the canvas cloth and drew his knees to his chest. The breeze blew his tangle of hair off his face. "Mesores, that's good," he said with a sigh. "That hold is so nasty that I was starting to wish you'd dropped me overboard." I leaned back and tilted my head up. With no moon out, there were so many stars. I felt like I could drag my hand through the sky and catch them in my fingers. "I will never get tired of that view," I said. "Back in Anlung, you were lucky if you could see more than a dozen stars." "What's Anlung like?" asked Beau. It would take me all night to explain my beautiful, vicious, magnificent, dirty hometown, so I just said, "It rains a lot." Beau nodded, as if that painted the whole picture. "I'm half Mancon," he said flatly. I wasn't surprised to hear it. The slender shape of his eyes, the black hair, and the gold-brown skin were familiar for sure. But he had a mix of other features, a narrower nose and face than most people in our 9 islands. And his eyes were a color you rarely saw in Mancon, green and brown swirled together like a fern stem. "And half what else?" I asked. "I was born in Amnaj." That explained Beau's hard-scrabble life. By the war's end, Amnaj, Mancon's tiny ally, had been nearly destroyed by the Hinmak forces, and anyone alive had fled in boats. "So your parents, were they killed in the war?" "My dad was, yeah." I felt a flush of shame for having a parent who never even fought at all. Mud had dodged the Navy for years, and then in the last months of the war had broken his leg during a brawl in jail. "I'm sorry," I said. Beau shrugged as if he were talking about strangers. "My mom took off after I was born, so that left me with my old auntie. She got us on a boat to Pattaya Island. She took care of me the best she could, taught me to read, kept a roof over us. But in the end, I was the one taking care of her. Her mind started to go. She'd tell me these wild bedtime stories, but then her stories got mixed up with real life, and she started to live in them. That's when I learned to pick pockets." "Did you leave her back there on Pattaya Island?" Beau cleared his throat. "She left me. Died 3 months ago." "Tripe, I'm sorry." "It's fine." Beau looked up at the stars. I'd been looking for a ship going to Mancon for a while, but none of the ones that docked at Pattaya were big enough to stow away on. When I saw this one, I thought, well, that's perfect. It's enormous, and it'll take me back to the place where my people are. But I guess Falin will work for now, and I can make my way to Anlong on some other ship. I couldn't help feeling sorry for Beau as he spoke about going to Mancon. He had no idea that he couldn't just stroll in and start a life there, especially with no lineal, no parents, no connections. I knew exactly where he'd end up. The fens swallowed people like him and never let them out. Mengkon isn't the easiest place to make your way, I said. He stretched his arms overhead. I'm not worried about it. Just give me a big, busy town. If I can't find work, I can always pick pockets. I smiled at him. Maybe you should practice a little more then. Beau gasped, pretending to be offended, and then jabbed me on the shoulder. About that, in all my time picking, no one's ever caught me. How in the world did you... He stopped abruptly and held up one finger. After another moment, I heard it too. Someone walking across the main deck, getting closer. We both flattened against the packed canvas. I slowly peeked around the side. It's Master Paiyoon, I whispered. He stood at the rail on the port side, looking up at the stars with his eyeglass. I thought you said he'd be sleeping, whispered Beau. It looks like he's taking a longitude reading, I said. But that can't be right. You need the sun for that. Measuring our latitude, how far north or south we were from the equator, was one of my duties because it was fairly simple. But I was still learning how to calculate our longitude, the ship's east-west position. It involved using a whole book's worth of tables along with the ship's clocks, one of which was always set to the local time in Anlung. And it involved the sun, so what could the old man be up to at this hour of night? More boots clicked across wooden boards. My eyes followed the sound, and I caught the tall figure of Miss Rian rising from the companionway. My stomach lurched at the thought that the card game was over and the entire crew would be coming up behind her. But the muffled sound of laughter from below told me that Rian must just be taking a break. When Paiyoon realized that Rian was there, he snapped his eyeglass back into its case and shoved it into his pocket. They began talking to each other, but the wind was too loud for me to hear. Stay here, I whispered to Beau. I want to know what they're saying. I stayed low and crept back down to the main deck. Tiptoeing around barrels and boxes, I circled close enough to make out their words. In 6 weeks at this pace, said Paiyoon. I guessed he must be talking about when our ship would arrive at the 50th parallel. I see. That's good news, said Rian. I peeked along the edge of the box I was hiding behind. I almost wanted to laugh at them. They looked like actors, each playing a part that didn't come naturally to them. Rian was trying very hard to be taken seriously, while the serious Paiyoon leaned against the rail, trying to act casual. And have you decided what course we'll take after that? Asked Rian. Master Paiyoon shrugged, but I could tell from the prickle in his voice that he was annoyed to be questioned. Nearly. The captain and I will make our final decision after we reach Falin. I've tried to encourage the captain to plan a route into the Harbinger Sea, said Rian. From what I have heard, that part of the world holds promise for all sorts of discoveries. Paiyoon shook his head, his signal that the argument was settled. That route is a waste of time, just empty ocean and rough water. Rian pressed on. Sailors have come back from the Harbinger Sea reporting sightings of land. Those sightings line up with our ancient stories about the Sunderlands. Ah, you mean the ancient stories of dragons. Paiyoon laughed gruffly. Perhaps we can get Lark to catch one in his net, and it will tug us all the way to its homeland? No, of course not, but... Paiyoon patted Rian's arm. Someone has been filling your head with nursery tales, Miss Rian. Maybe your fellow card players? Just then someone burst into laughter below decks. Don't pay too much attention to what you hear from the crew. I have been at this business a long time, and I promise that whatever you've heard about dragons or magical lands is fantasy. You could fill the ocean with sailors' tales and have no more than a thimbleful of truth in the whole thing. Rian straightened up taller, and I felt a swell of pride that she wouldn't let Paiyoon speak down to her. Sir, the captain has told me about the Sunderland's prize. If the place doesn't exist, then why would the Queen offer a prize to find it? The only people on this earth more superstitious than sailors are members of the royal family, as our good captain will agree. Paiyoon's smile was kind, but also a little insulting, as if Rian were a toddler who had to be coaxed away from a plate of cookies. Trust me, Miss Rian, we shall make wonderful discoveries on this voyage, but not if we set our sights on chasing a fairy tale. Rian started to reply, but one of the crew called her name from the galley below. She bowed reluctantly to Master Paiyoon, then turned to leave, her coat-tail swirling around her knees. Paiyoon watched her until she was below decks. Once she was gone, the old man gave out a big, weary sigh and rubbed the space between his eyes. I bit my bottom lip in frustration as I watched Paiyoon return to his room. Our chance to do something truly great was crumbling before we would even get started, all before Paiyoon refused to listen to anyone but himself. That lineal is as good as gone, I whispered to myself. What lineal? I whirled around to find Beau crouched directly behind me. For tripe's sake, I hissed. I told you to wait back there for me. You were taking too long. What are you talking about? And who is that woman your mapmaker was talking to? Everything seemed so hopeless that I didn't see the point of keeping it a secret. I quickly ran through what Miss Rian had told me about the expedition prize. The Dragonlands, Beau snorted. Come on now, you're joking. Yeah, I know, I grumbled. Everyone says the same thing. I did too, at first. The minute they hear the name Sunderlands, they think... Well, said Beau, raising his eyebrows. They think what? He's doing it, I muttered. Triping tripe, he's doing it. Beau leaned back. What's got into you? Doing what? Paiyoon told me that a mapmaker has to see what's actually there, not what they expect to see. But now he's making that very mistake. Paiyoon has already gotten it into his head that the Sunderlands are nonsense. It doesn't matter what anyone tells him. The only thing that will persuade him that the Sunderlands are worth looking for is actual evidence. That's the point of the Sunderlands, isn't it? Said Beau. No one's got any evidence. Maybe not. Or maybe they do, but they haven't fit it together in the right way yet. Paiyoon brought almost the entire contents of his shop with him. Every chart of the Southern Hemisphere, copies of ship's logs, captain's journals. He could be overlooking something really important just because he doesn't expect to find it. If I could get hold of those documents and go through them, maybe I could gather enough evidence to make him come around. It sounds like a plan. Best of luck to you. Beau yawned and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, his pickpocket hands. Best of luck to us, you mean? Me? What have I got to do with it? Paiyoon would never let me rifle through his papers. I need someone to slip in and get them for me, someone with world-class thievery skills. Why don't you just tell him what you think and go through the stuff together? You told me he trusts you, right? I shook my head. No, if I say anything else about the Sunderlands, he'll shut down again, just like he did with Rian. But if I could work on this on my own, maybe I could make a good case to him. It's like me with my map making. Maybe Paiyoon just needs a little taste of success to believe in it. Beau crossed his arms. And why should I help you? I wanted to shout, because you're eating half of my meals and I'm keeping you alive, that's why. I hesitated before I finally said, because if you do, and we're awarded the prize, I'll give you 1 link from my lineal. It hurt to say the words, but I couldn't think of anything else to offer. A link from one of those useless pieces of jewelry, said Beau. What am I supposed to do with that? I rolled my eyes. I don't care what you do with it. You could melt it down or use it as fish bait. At the least, you could sell it on the shadow market and get some cash to put in your pocket. Beau fidgeted with his collar as he looked out to sea. He caught me watching him and set his face into a scowl. This means I'll have to stay with the ship longer, to make sure you don't cheat me out of my payment. I'm not the cheat, let's remember that, I said. And yes, you'd have to stay with the ship. But you wanted to go to Mengkan, didn't you? That's exactly where we're going to end up. I could tell Beau was mentally calculating how many picked pockets 1 golden link was worth. Fine, but if I've got to stay down in that hold longer, I'm going to need a proper lantern and more ginger biscuits. Fine, I held out my hand. Beau spat into his palm, and before I could back away, he grabbed my hand. The saliva made a squirch between our fingers. Ew! Now we've got a deal, Beau grinned. So, when do we start, partner?